COVID, we were already facing all of this sort of stuff, right? We were already deep into exponentially disruptive change. What happens often to people and organizations and communities in that space is they go into a state that we call managed adaptive decline, right? What that is really well managing a gradual adaptation to a declining set of conditions, or MAD. And it is madness. What we find ourselves doing more and more, particularly in boardrooms with senior leadership groups, with councils, with leadership teams, in local government, is asking the question, are you in managed adaptive decline? Are you slowly boiling to death? The old boiling frog metaphor, what's most important about that is not that the frog gradually adapts to the heating water, it's that when it realizes that maybe it shouldn't be in the water any longer, that gradual adaptation has meant that it's lost the capability to get out of the pot. The muscles don't function anymore, it can't leap out of the pot. When an organization or a community or an individual is in managed adaptive decline, what sometimes happens is that when we realize we need to change, it's too late and we've lost the capability to change. So again, that change ahead of change principle becomes really important. So just a little quick question. These are some, not all, but some of the symptoms that we see in organizations, communities, and sometimes in people of managed adaptive decline. So are you seeing these signs and symptoms in your organization or in your community, or in some cases both? Set and forget strategies and plans. A narrative which is, this is the way we've always done it. We couldn't have foreseen that coming. Responding to rather than leading change. There's many more, but these are just a few. So what are you seeing in terms of managed adaptive decline? And while we're doing this, Elaine and I will look to a few of the comments in the chat. Margaret has said, mad in education university system in extreme. Yep, I wholeheartedly agree with that one. Well and truly time for a breakthrough.
David, Margaret's continued with her comment and said, people are not saying this is the way we've always done it. They say the opposite, but don't mean it to actually change anything. Is that something that you're going to be touching on later?
Yes, we will get into that a little bit when people pretend like they're going to change, but really have no intention of changing. And the deeper what we notice is that the deeper the sort of legacy systems are, and the longer we've been hanging on to them, the harder it is to change. The weight of those systems actually starts to pull some organizations deeper into managed adaptive decline. Or you make these little micro innovations that aren't intended to change anything. All right, I'm going to push on from that poll and get into what are we seeing in terms of the COVID economy rising. So when COVID hit, we went into analyst mode. We could think of ourselves as strategists, analysts, and coaches. We don't do strategic planning for people or organizations or communities. We teach and coach and support folks to use a framework, which I'll explain in a little bit, and then we do our own analysis of what we're seeing going on. So Horizon Zero, think of that as pre-COVID. We were very oriented mostly to business as usual. There's little bits of innovation happening, but certainly not at scale, and certainly already we were feeling like Australia was a bit behind the eight ball in terms of global innovation, particularly in areas like manufacturing, where there's real advances happening in other places. So there was this sort of keep calm, excuse me, business as usual mindset. Then we had catastrophic bushfires, which I don't think this group will need reminding, were spotted about 12 years prior in terms of 2020 being pointed out in 2008-9 roughly as a critical bushfire year that mostly got ignored. We're dealing with things like Brexit, which is an example of breakdown starting to happen in systems, and for a lot of people, they're in a bit of a kind of crash test dummy, experience. We'll pretend to change, bounce people into change, go back to the way it was, do that. So that's just the reality of where we were in facing all those other sorts of disruptions. Then COVID hit, and we had a bit of shattering of life. And what we observed is people going into shock, disorientation, bit of denial, grief, frustration. And for a lot of people, that still exists. We haven't necessarily come through that, but when you have a major shock, it's a bit of, that's what we go through. That's the part of the human condition and the human experience. It's the Kubler-Ross, sort of cycle, right? And you drop straight into some version of a major disruption. What we then saw start to emerge is you call it COVID normal, a way of operating in COVID. And it's a reorganization very quickly of certain aspects of our systems in the context of going into some version of quarantine, lockdown, safety, health, all that sort of stuff. We're all now working online quite comfortably. And a lot of that future of work stuff that we were looking at, say, over here in Horizon Zero, became real very quickly in terms of reorienting and reorganizing where people are working, how they're interfacing. We think that we're somewhere mostly in this space here, that we're sort of vacillating, particularly in Victoria, back and forth between wrestling with what's starting to emerge, making sense of that, and then, the ups and downs of lockdown push a lot of us back into that shock, denial, frustration. What is really important is, how do we get oriented to where the future is going? When you're disoriented, it's hard to make sensible decisions about where you're going. We sometimes describe it, it's a bit like if you'd, been walking down the street and there'd been an explosion near enough to you that it knocked you over, but not near enough that could do real bodily damage, and you lose your sense of balance and your hearing, and you stand up and you have to kind of gather yourself to reorient to continue going down the street. Now, if there was another explosion, it knocked you over again, you get further disoriented. And when you hit waves of massive global disruption, what happens is people keep going into disorientation. Not in an explosive context, but in the context that we're facing, what becomes very tempting is to orient to the way things used to be, because it feels a bit firm and solid and we can hang on to the world as it was, rather than looking to what is coming and thinking about how do we orient and take ourselves into that future. As we get into a reorientation to the COVID economy, there's a lot of narrative around what is post-COVID going to look like. We've given up on post-COVID. We don't think we're coming out of COVID. COVID is now part of our existence. We might get a vaccine, we might not. We might have better treatment, we might not. Ultimately, I think we all know we have to learn how to better live now with COVID as another part of our human experience. What we are seeing now emerge in simple terms is a growing debt bomb. It's more complex than that. We're starting to think a little bit in terms of GFC 2.0. That's an easy way to get people to start thinking about it. That's not absolutely accurate to what's going on. But prior to 2020, we had significant both domestic and sovereign debt globally. We've then had most economies stabilized by pumping a whole bunch of stimulus money into the system. That has to be paid back at some point in some way. So that accrues more debt in the system. The big brains on Wall Street coming out of the first GFC have learned not well from that and done some more shady stuff, collateralizing commercial lending, really high interest cash flow loans. Those were, again, like collateralized debt obligations were a decade and a bit ago, then securitized and sold as AAA rated investments, because no one could imagine a world in which at scale, small to medium sized enterprise couldn't pay back high interest loans. Welcome to pandemic and the social economic implications of that. And we're looking potentially at major defaults on those high interest loans, and that flowing through the system. The GFC mostly impacted individuals, didn't have a huge impact on organizations. This one may. We know that the implications of that are around liquidity and cash flow. And so we are staring down the barrel of a combination of debt, liquidity potentially drying up even more so than it has. And then, of course, stimulus coming off at some point. Organizations that have been holding on potentially having to shut down in that context, people who haven't had to repay debt having to repay debt, and you get that combination where we could be staring down the barrel of a pretty significant financial shock. Now, this is not doom and gloom stuff. This is not scare people. This is about get real about what could be emerging in the COVID economy, and what do we do now to leverage that disruption? What do we stop doing because it could be much riskier as we get further down the track? What do we start doing now to better position ourselves if and when the debt bomb and other things converge and explode? That's the sort of thinking that we're looking for. It's not doom and gloom stuff. It's just let's deal with reality and get out in front of reality if we can. We're seeing again in this space that managed adaptive decline could sort of get a little injection of steroids as people really start to cling to the past. So at the end of the day, what happens in this space, we think very much starts to determine what we call Horizon 4 might look like. And for us, it's sort of, equally at this point, a real opportunity for transformation or destruction. And that's around value. So are we going to transform the way that we generate value and how we value that and how that aligns to our values? And we're seeing real signs that might be starting to gain some traction. Or are we going to once again ignore a lot of what is happening and could happen and push ourselves back into another major disruption and go through the cycle again? And we see this as a very active choice that people have. Whatever roles that you have in business, in community, in your family, the active choices we make now very much impact where we'll be positioned in this space. What we know absolutely is that the most important thing in this Horizon 4 is planetary health. And we've got to think about that as planetary health for the species that currently inhabit the planet, including people. Because the planet as a system doesn't require us, we require it. So when it comes to major system reset, we shouldn't presume that we have to be here. What we need to think about is how can we really make planetary health a priority? How does that align to our values, to the value we're trying to generate in the world? And in effect, what we're talking about is how do we build a bridge consciously from where we are now into that space? And if you're thinking about what do I do in terms of new opportunities, in terms of innovation, in terms of risks that I'm exposed to, be thinking about the debt bomb, be thinking about planetary health and the value we can create around that. We see those as really powerful in terms of what's emerging. And then what does that mean from an education perspective? What does it mean from a healthcare perspective? What does it mean from a political perspective? And this is just a high level, get people thinking view. I haven't even touched on the polarization of politics, of trade wars, conflict globally, other health issues. There's an enormous complexity starting to be revealed in the COVID economy. The way I sometimes think about it is that the pandemic has ripped the Band-Aid off a bit of a festering wound that was already there, and it's being laid bare now for us in very real terms, and the rules are sort of being written in real time. Relying on the data and information that we had through to the end of 2019 is risky because all of that was created in a pre-global pandemic world. Some of it will be useful. We've got to work out what that is and take it forward, but we're also going to have to let go to a certain extent of the way that we did see the world and what we thought might be possible. And we've had to do that too. This is our space, and we had to stop and reset and reorient and think about what is it that we really want to focus on next to contribute, hopefully, to being part of this journey here. Because this is the one for me. Why do I do what I do? I've got kids. I presume one day those kids might have grandkids. I'd like to see this become a real priority for them. We hosted a breakfast towards the end of last year, and Richard Haynes joined us. And if you don't know who Richard is, worth checking out his work. He founded something called the Center for the Future, and Richard did a keynote at this breakfast in December. His assertion, and he's labeled a futurist, he doesn't like it, but his assertion was that the systems that we operate in, all systems, education, health, political, transport, etc., were designed mostly in the period immediately post World War II. We know education goes back a bit further, etc., but they were designed